In this video, I'll walk you through the different types of immunity, and then I'll teach you specifically about innate immunity, complement, and inflammation. So here we see that immunity is really the ability to resist damage from foreign substances, such as microorganisms and harmful chemicals. Some of these chemicals are from the environment, from other creatures, or just nature in general. And so we have to be able to fend off germs and keep ourselves from being damaged by these environmental toxins. Different types of immunity are broken apart into this so-called innate or non-specific resistance and adaptive or specific immunity. So non-specific resistance involves physical barriers to try to keep germs or chemicals from getting into our body: skin, tears, saliva, mucus, and mucous membranes. These are part of what we sometimes call the acid mantle, and nearly all of these fluids have an acidic pH as a way of trying to prevent germs from setting up shop in our mouths or noses or on our skin. Now, it's certainly not perfect because we do get skin infections and respiratory and digestive infections, but man, it would be a lot worse if we didn't have these barriers. Chemical mediators on the skin and as a part of innate immune reactions help to stimulate some of our white blood cells to go to work and trigger a process called inflammation, which causes changes in tissue and fluid and blood vessel flow and attracts a specific part of the immune system. Cells, like neutrophils and macrophages, are involved in this phagocytosis and the production of chemicals. Adaptive or specific immunity is the body's ability to recognize a particular substance. So if I were to develop an allergy to peanuts, my body would have really recognized that. And anytime I had peanuts in the future, it would trigger this big response. The same thing with germs, right? If I have been infected with chickenpox, then it's very unlikely that I'll come down with another case of chickenpox because my body has learned what that is and how to fight it off. This ability to develop an immunological memory is really an amazing phenomenon that we see in living creatures. Okay, so let's talk about innate immunity first, and then in the next video we'll look at specific immunity. As we mentioned, skin, mucous membranes, cilia, coughing and sneezing, fever, these are all examples of innate immunity. And we can see that there are some specific chemicals here that allow the body to react. Histamine is a big one, right? If you've ever been stung by a bee, or if you have hay fever, or if you're allergic to cats, then you know that this chemical triggers itchy, watery, red, and swollen tissue. Kinins help to cause a little bit of movement, vasodilation, stimulate pain receptors. So bee stings involve a lot of these. Leukotrienes and interferons are what allow white blood cells to try to inhibit viral infection in this case and attract new blood cells over here. Pyrogens, pyro means fire, so this means fire creators, and these are what trigger fever. And so certain bacteria release pyrogens, certain viruses stimulate our white blood cells to release these pyrogens as a way of trying to cook the germs. And then complement, really an amazing family of plasma proteins, self-assembling immunological weapons that we'll learn about right here. Complement, a group of 20 plasma proteins that circulate in the blood in an inactive form, sort of like what we had seen with fibrinogen. Remember that cascade of coagulation that ultimately turned fibrinogen into fibrin, and you have a little bit of an idea of how complement works. Look in the Blackboard Chapter 22 folder for the video about complement, and it really makes this come to life. We can see there are a couple of different pathways, the alternative and classical pathways, two different chemical cascades that activate complement. When complement proteins start to stick together, they can form these membrane attack complexes that look like little straws. They sort of punch through the cell membrane of the germ and can cause the germ just to die from osmotic shock. Complement can also attach to the surface of bacterial cells, sort of marking them for death, so that white blood cells who pass by are drawn to this and they know that's the guy that they're supposed to eat. Complement also triggers inflammation. Here we can see the nitty-gritty detail of complement, and very much like what we had seen in the coagulation pathway, these things were named for the order that they were discovered, not necessarily the order that they work, which is so frustrating. The good news is you don't really need to know too much about this. You need to know what complement does. Forms the MAC, stimulates the germs to be eaten by marking them for death, and promoting inflammation. Here we can see a membrane attack complex. Look at it, it does look like a little straw. And so when this germ gets marked for death, it may also end up with a whole bunch of these little holes punched in it, the membrane attack complexes. Yes, here's the video on slide number 22, and you can watch this at your leisure to get a better idea of how complement works. Interferons are one class of chemicals amongst a whole bunch of them we had seen on that prior chart. Chemicals used by the immune system to prevent viral replication in particular. Interferons interfere with viral replication. The cells of innate immunity are these ones, the neutrophils and macrophages. These are very important white blood cells, and they can tell the difference between your cells and germs. But they can't tell the difference between one germ and another. So these are non-specific immunological fighters, and we're going to see in the next video that these are the antigen-presenting cells, meaning that not only do they attack the germs as our frontline fighters, but they pass the message along to specific immunity, namely the T cells and B cells. Remember that neutrophils are filled with these little granules. These ones cross the GI tract, by the way, coming in and out of the gut lining, and they're sort of like scouts on the periphery looking for germs. Macrophages start out as monocytes, but when they leave the blood and run into germs, they transform themselves into these large aggressive cells called macrophages, sort of like the Incredible Hulk, right? This is the mild-mannered copy repairman, and this is the big green hulking giant. One transforms into the other. Basophils and mast cells are also innate immunological cells. They promote inflammation when they're activated, and they release histamine primarily, causing redness and swelling and attracting a lot of white blood cells to the site of allergy or infection. Eosinophils reduce inflammation by breaking down chemicals, and so they sort of keep the basophils in check, and they also kill some parasites. Natural killer cells are virus and cancer fighters, and they're a type of a lymphocyte, but they don't need to be specifically trained onto an antigen. They will recognize a cancer cell without having seen it before, and they will recognize a cell infected with a virus even if they've never seen that virus before. And they do that with a special little tag on the cell. We'll talk about that in a little bit. It's called an MHC class 1. Inflammation. Now I understand when you think of inflammation, you think that's a bad thing because you see it when tissue is damaged, you see it when there's an infection, and you see it when there are tumors or when there's something wrong. The thing is, it's not necessarily bad. It is the body's response to tissue injury. And so no matter what happens, if it's a metabolic injury or an immunological injury or an autoimmune injury or a tumor or a virus, whatever way the tissue is damaged, it will send off these chemical signals. Help, help, we've been damaged. That's really what inflammation is. Inflammation is this response to tissue damage. Inflammation often occurs at the local level, right? If you sprain your ankle, just your ankle gets red, hot, swollen, painful, and suffers a loss of function. These are, by the way, the characteristic features of inflammation: redness, heat, swelling, pain, and loss of function or dysfunction. Some forms of inflammation are systemic, though. It can happen like the whole body. Examples of that are anaphylactic reaction, like we see here, triggered histamines, or fever because of pyrogens, or the increased number of neutrophils because of septicemia. These are all examples of inflammation sort of in the big sense. The whole body is reacting to them. Most of the time, clinically, we just see local inflammation, but you might be interested to know that nearly every disease has an inflammatory component, even diseases like osteoporosis, some forms of cancer, neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's and multiple sclerosis also have an inflammatory component. We don't talk about it too much in this class. A little bit later in the next class when we learn about digestion and metabolism. But a lot of scientists believe that our diet has a huge effect on our inflammatory response, and that a diet high in refined carbohydrates and high in corn oil or saturated fat, corn-fed animals, triggers a much greater inflammatory response than historically it used to. The flip side of that would be a diet high in fruits and vegetables, low in sugar, and high in omega-3 fatty acids, which we're really talking about the Mediterranean diet here. That is an anti-inflammatory diet. And that very well may be one of the most important links between diet and the development of disease. If I eat cheeseburgers and French fries every day, I am going to be so inflamed that I am more likely to develop many of these diseases. Whereas if I eat a very sensible Paleolithic or Mediterranean diet, I'll be much less likely to develop those. Anyway, just a quick aside, inflammation can be a systemic thing from our diet that can predispose us to the development of many different diseases, although we typically see inflammation on the local level. Here's an interesting flow chart, and I'll relate this to some images in our lab the next time we meet. Okay, in the next video, we'll walk through specific or adaptive immunity and understand how our body can develop immunological memory and antibodies.